Hi there, Bio20s. Today's topic is gas exchange and how gases are transported through the body and how breathing is controlled or regulated in your body. One of the main things we talk about in Bio 30 is surface area. So, remember when we talked about the digestive system and we talked about that inside of the small intestine are these little things called villi, and then on the villi are these little microvilli, and so all the enzymes can get in there, and that's where digestion happens, and that increases the surface area for enzymes to get at and digest food. Well, this concept of surface area is important here in the respiratory system as well. And it relates to the number of alveoli, the air sacs where gas exchange is happening. So if we had just one giant lung with no little tiny alveoli in it, this is what we call a low surface area, right? Like if I was to take and measure all the way around here and add it up, this is what my surface area would be. So now if I have millions of these little alveoli, and this is what our lungs actually are. So if I could to lay these out for the exchange is happening across this membrane, right? So if I was to lay this out and I combined all of those alveoli together, I couldn't even fit them on the page, right? The surface area is much higher. And so the surface area is much, much higher for when you have all these teeny tiny little alveoli. And so that means that you can have more gas exchange occurring in your lungs. And of course, that's external respiration. Next up, let's talk about these two important gases. Oxygen is either going to be dissolved in the plasma or it binds to hemoglobin. And the most common thing that you see is actually 99% of oxygen will actually travel bound to hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is this massive protein molecule, and this is a little picture of it. And you'll notice that there are these little yellow spots on it. That's a heme group, and that's where iron is, and oxygen is able to bind to each heme. And so when oxygen binds, it's oxyhemoglobin. That's the bright red color of your arterial blood, and when you don't have oxygen bound, it's deoxyhemoglobin. And so it's a dark, more purpley color, like the color you get when you cut yourself. And those are veins and capillaries that have that kind of deoxygenated blood. Okay, so the major way here of transporting oxygen, it's done in two ways, is by hemoglobin. Okay, so there is some in the plasma, but mainly it's hemoglobin. What about CO2? Well, CO2 is actually going to be transported in three different ways. So you see right there, there's a difference, right? There's three ways for CO2, but only two ways to transport oxygen. And yes, it's as hemoglobin, just like we saw for O2, also as in plasma, just floating around in your blood plasma. But the majority, the main way that CO2 is transported is as what are called bicarbonate ions. So when CO2 comes out of a body cell, a body tissue, it goes into the bloodstream. And then there's an enzyme in your blood that is in your red blood cells. And that enzyme is called carbonic anhydrase. And his job is to take the CO2 and join it up with a water molecule to form this H2CO3, and we call that carbonic acid. Now, being it's an acid, it breaks apart very easily. It ionizes and it forms this molecule, and this molecule is called the bicarbonate ion. So this bicarbonate ion is important because that is how the majority of your CO2 is transported. And then once you get back to your lungs, the reverse reaction occurs. And so that bicarbonate ion reacts with the hydrogen, forms this acid, and then that enzyme comes along again and it releases the CO2. So this is happening in the lungs. And of course, this is what we call external respiration, right? So coming from your body, we have this blood that's high in CO2. That's why it looks blue, because there's so much CO2 and not very much oxygen. It's low in oxygen. And so the CO2 is going to move from its high concentration into its low concentration into the alveoli. And then you exhale out the CO2. You breathe it out. On the other hand, the O2 is coming in, and that O2 is then going to diffuse, right? It moves across this skinny little membrane, and it moves across this little capillary membrane, and it goes into the bloodstream. And of course, we know that it's going to bind with the hemoglobin. So this blood that's heading out to your body, remember, this is leaving the lungs. So we're talking about the pulmonary veins that are going to be coming back to the heart, and that's the only veins in the whole body that have oxygen in them, right? They're highly oxygenated, and then they pass through the left ventricle and they go out the aorta to the entire body, and you get lots of oxygens being sent to your body cells. Okay, so next thing up is, how do I control my breathing? What makes me breathe faster or slower? What is it that even causes me to breathe in the first place? Well, the main concepts here are, and there's 3 of them, is, and this is going to surprise a lot of you guys, CO2 is actually more important than oxygen for regulating your breathing. So your CO2 levels, if they get too high in your body, you have special sensors in your body called chemoreceptors. Chemo because they respond to chemicals like CO2 or too much acid, right? Like that bicarbonate and the hydrogen ion, the acid. So if you get too much CO2, then these chemoreceptors send messages to your brain. And this part of the brain, called the medulla oblongata, then is like, oh no, we have too much CO2. Well, we got to get rid of it. So how does it do that? It increases your breathing rate. You're going to exhale more CO2 out. So that is how your body regulates the breathing levels. And it's interesting to note, this little did you know here is kind of interesting, that it shows that at different altitudes, you're going to have different ability to bind oxygen by your hemoglobin. So if you're living at a really high up in the mountains, there's very little oxygen up there. And so as a result, you still need to get the same amount of oxygen to your cells. So your red blood cells actually have more hemoglobin and are better at carrying oxygen than people who live at sea level. And of course, this comes about in the Olympics, right? You hear about people that go to the Olympics and they train ahead of time. They train, like if it's at a very high elevation, Mexico City, this happened for, it happened for Salt Lake City. They trained there to acclimate ahead of time. They went there months in advance so that their body would actually start making more hemoglobin, because when you do a blood test, you would actually find, well, they have extra hemoglobin. Unfortunately, though, some people clued into that, and people do what is called blood doping. And that is by adding in this drug called erythropoietin that actually increases your hemoglobin levels. Guess what? This is cheating, right? Because no, they're not living there and training. They're taking a drug that artificially is going to make them better at carrying oxygen so that they're better at being able to deliver oxygen to their body cells and be a better athlete. Okay, so now just a short video here. I wanted to show you guys this CO2 transport video, and it shows there's a big giant green thing that's going to come out here in just a second, and that's our carbonic anhydrase. Okay, so I'm going to let the person narrating talk about the video, and then I'm going to pause it and just talk about a couple of key concepts here.
From tissues, carbon dioxide diffuses into blood, where a small amount of it dissolves. The remaining molecules enter the red blood cells, where they combine with water and eventually convert to hydrogen and bicarbonate ions.
Okay, so this big green giant thing here, that's the carbonic anhydrase enzyme. You can also see a couple of other important molecules up here as well. Okay, I mentioned that the CO2 molecule, here's the CO2 molecule, will be combined with a water molecule. Okay, and so that's the job of this guy, the carbonic anhydrase. So watch here, we're going to see, here's his active site, right? That's where he's going to bind these two guys. He's an enzyme. These are the two substrates, and he's going to put them together to make the hydrogen carbonate, which will then break down and form carbonate ions.
An enzyme found only inside red blood cells speeds up the reaction 250 times.
Okay, so boom, there, that little molecule that was just created, that is carbonic acid, H2CO3, and then it breaks apart right away afterwards, and it forms.
During this
Okay, so there you go. Here is the little white guy that just took off there. That was a hydrogen ion. And then this guy here, that is the bicarbonate ion. And so the most of your CO2 is going to be transported as this bicarbonate ion in your bloodstream. And of course, when you get into the lungs, the reverse reaction occurs. This enzyme comes out again, and it is going to take these two molecules, put them together, and then release CO2. And then that CO2 gets released at your alveoli during external respiration. Okay, so you got some videos to watch this week, questions to do on breathing, gas exchange, regulation of breathing. Hopefully this clarifies some things. And if you have any questions, as always, you're more than welcome to email me, michelle.ledeen@ghsd75.ca. Talk to you later.